want to thank our other co-sponsors, which include MISNA, Arab American Cultural Organization, Twin Cities IWW, Living Table United Church of Christ, and Students for Justice in Palestine at the University of Minnesota. So thank you all. I also want to thank our fantastic speakers for being here with us tonight and introduce them. So Malak Shahin is a local Palestinian American activist, and Ramah Kudaimi is the Director of Grassroots Organizing at the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, and she serves on the National Committee for the War Resisters League. So let's give them both a round of applause.
Okay, cool. So I think we kind of decided that I start off. Is this right? Okay, cool. So I'm going to talk about Palestine for like 20 minutes, and the hard thing with preparing this kind of stuff is I don't usually know where people are in their education, so I'm just going to ask for like a raise of hands. So how many of you know what Zionism is? What Zionism is? Do I need to speak up?
Turn up the volume on the speakers.
Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Okay, so how many of you know like what the Nakba is, or like 1948? Right? Good amount of you. Okay, I think I'll start with defining and then move on to the Nakba and then kind of skip forward a little bit. I'm not going to go through all of the history, but I'll try to give some resources at the end too, so people can like look afterwards if they want. So Zionism is, when we're talking about Zionism, we're talking about modern political Zionism, because there's different strains of Zionism that started like way back when they were first talking about it, and I think a Jewish person would be better to talk about that, because I don't know all of the different strains of Zionism. But when we're talking about Zionism now, it's modern political Zionism, and the founding father is considered to be Theodor Herzl, and he defines Zionism as a colonial idea. He approached Cecil Rhodes, who's the dude who like colonized South Africa. So he had recently colonized the territory of the Shona people as Rhodesia. We were being invited to help make history, Theodor Herzl said in a letter to Rhodes. It doesn't involve Africa, but a piece of Asia Minor. Not Englishmen, but Jews. How then do I happen to turn to you, since this is an out-of-the-way matter for you? How indeed? Because it is something colonial. So I think in understanding the relationship between Israel and Britain and Israel and the West in general, it's important to look at the roots of it, which is the fact that they shared, it was a continuation of European colonialism and imperialism in the Middle East and Africa, everywhere. Because one of the other places that Israel, or not Israel, but Zionisms thought of making their homeland was Uganda, and then also Argentina, I believe. But they chose Palestine for some pretty obvious reasons. Yeah, and then Theodor Herzl also says something. So again, this leads back to what I mean about the relationship between the West and Israel. He looked at Israel as a state that would constitute for Europe and Palestine a part of the wall against Asia and serve as a vanguard of civilization against barbarism. So again, when we're thinking about like how Israel's portrayed in the news as the only democracy in the Middle East, and how Palestinians are portrayed as backwards, and like all these Orientalist and like Islamophobic stereotypes that are again hammered away when we mention Palestinians in mainstream news, which isn't often unless they want to blame us for terrorism. It's by referencing this like long legacy of colonialism, which is talking about indigenous people as savages, as barbaric. So I think that is really important to understanding the roots of Israel, because it is a violent settler colonial project, and the fact that it in America have such a special relationship and have these shared values, you have to look at the fact that they're both violent, genocidal settler colonial states, and they continue to do this to this day, and they continue to inflict violence all over the world. So I think, was that a good way of like talking about Zionism? Do you guys feel like you understand it a little bit better now?
Yeah.
Sounds good. So then when the State of Israel was created in 1948, officially, that was when the Nakba happened. The Nakba means catastrophe in Arabic, and this refers to the mass expulsion of Palestinians. So 78% of Palestine came under Israeli control, 22% was divided into the West Bank, which was ruled over by Jordan until 67, and then Gaza was ruled over by Egypt. Nearly 1 million Palestinians became refugees by Zionist forces, and this isn't to mention the countless Palestinians who were killed. So at least 24 massacres of Palestinian civilians by Zionist and Israeli forces, which played a crucial role in spurring the mass flight of Palestinians from their homes. A lot of Palestinians who left behind everything because they assumed they would come back when the war was over. So a lot of older Palestinians have the keys to their original houses because they assumed they would come back. And it's become the symbol of return. Because the right of return is a really important part of Palestinian advocacy and activism. And then more than 400 was the number of Palestinian cities and towns systematically destroyed by Zionist forces or repopulated with Jews from 1948 to 1950. And these facts are from the Institute for Middle Eastern Understanding. But approximately 4,244,776, the number of acres of Palestinian land expropriated by Israel during and immediately following its creation in 1948. So this was a huge loss for Palestinians, and more than 1 million Palestinians became refugees. Today there's around 7 million Palestinians living in the diaspora. And the diaspora includes the Palestinians living in the refugee camps in Lebanon, Jordan, Syria. There were some in Iraq, I think. But yeah, and then Palestinians who were living in the Gulf, and then Palestinians who are living, like in America, were literally everywhere. And that's because of the fact that we're not allowed to go back home from the Nakba. Okay, so that's kind of the history of the conflict. I don't really like calling it conflict because it's not accurate, but I kind of want to talk more about what's going on today and ways that we can all help, and we can how do you support local activists too. So I just graduated, but I was part of Students for Justice in Palestine at the University of Minnesota, and we've done 2 divestment campaigns, and both successful. This last one was a referendum in which we asked the university to divest from corporations that are complicit in Israeli violations of Palestinian human rights. It's been so long since I talked about this. Corporations that are active in that are establishing and maintaining private prisons and immigrant detention centers, and then also corporations that violate indigenous sovereignty. So what we did was connect all of these issues because they are very much connected. Like I said before, when we look at the roots of Zionism, it's very much a European colonial construct. And does someone want to get that? Yeah, so that's what we focused on. Go to our website. I think it's really important for us as activists and as people who are educating people on what Palestine is, and what Palestine means, and what the Palestinian cause is to be able to connect it to these issues. Because I think for people, when you connect it, it kind of drives it home to them. When we're saying that what's happening in Palestine is what was happening in Standing Rock. And also making sure people understand what was happening in Standing Rock was an issue of indigenous sovereignty just as much as it was an environmental issue, because that's also something that I think people were lacking, and that's why we use the terminology of indigenous sovereignty, because at first we were considering talking about environmental degradation and just linking it to indigenous sovereignty, but the fact of the matter is people don't get that. And so you have to talk about indigenous sovereignty. We have to recognize that we are on stolen land right now, and people don't see that. So we have to make those connections. And I think as indigenous peoples globally, we need to be able to link up and talk about how Israel and America continue to hurt indigenous people globally, as well as indigenous people in Palestine or in North America, Turtle Island. One thing I actually recently learned was that Israel was, they armed and trained Guatemalan soldiers when they were committing the genocide in the 80s against the Mayan people. So it's things like that where you learn and you're that makes sense, but that's so shitty and people don't know it. Because especially in the way that Israelis like to self-orientalize themselves and talk about how they're indigenous to the land. And that goes back to this claim that Israel Israel and Palestine is like this conflict that has been raging for 2,000 years between Muslims and Jews, and we can never get along. And it's really just a way of A, legitimizing their claim on the land, B, thinking about how in the post 9/11 era, in this war on terrorism, how framing it as a Jews versus Muslims thing always frames Muslims as the bad guys and always makes Palestinians look like we're the bad guys and we're terrorists and we're whatever. And then it also just ignores the fact that there are Palestinian Jewish people, there are Palestinian Christians who are also being persecuted. So we have to be very firm with how we frame things. And I think that was something that we were really trying to do with UMN Divest, which was our divestment campaign. So we were looking at the prison industrial complex and connecting that to Palestine, and I think that is something that also needs to be done more often. And I think right now, in terms of how people are paying a little bit more attention to what's happening in immigrant detention centers, I think people are asking the wrong things because they just want people to be detained together instead of being torn apart. And it's no, they shouldn't be detained at all. So I think these are things that are really difficult to talk about for people because they just don't see how a country in the Middle East is connected to the prison industrial complex in America. So by focusing on corporations, which is what we're doing through the divestment campaign, and divestment's asking the university to take out its investments in these funds that include corporations like G4S. And G4S is a company that is a British security company, and they've been really shady everywhere. So they were actually at Standing Rock too. They had the dogs, if you saw pictures of the dogs attacking indigenous water protectors. They were in Israeli prisons. I think there was rumors that they were leaving, or they said they were gonna pull out of Israel because of BDS pressure. They won't admit it, but it is because of BDS pressure. And what else did they do? They also do deportations. So there was an incident where an immigrant from, I think, Nigeria was being deported from England, and they died while in G4S custody because G4S used too much force. And then another company that is involved with not only private prisons but just regular prisons, Raytheon, which is a defense contracting company, and it's the world's largest producer of missiles. And they also rely on prison labor to produce weapons, but they've also used weapons against prisoners in the LA County Jail, weapons that weren't accepted by the US or whatever for contracts, so they were used by the LA County Jail on prisoners. So those are the kinds of things that our divestment campaign is looking at, and that BDS targets. And then for violating indigenous sovereignty, we're looking at G4S again, that was in Standing Rock. I think that one can go even broader because there's so many companies that are violating indigenous sovereignty continually. But we focused on G4S, Raytheon, it was Elbit Systems, I think. Yeah, and Elbit Systems built the apartheid wall in Palestine. So if you don't know, there is a really long wall that Israel built around settlements, and it's encroaching on Palestinian land. And settlements are illegal Israeli settlements. They're just little colonies that they have in the West Bank. And Elbit Systems is the one behind the wall, and this wall is I don't remember the exact number, it's 8 times as big as the Berlin Wall. And they're also the company that is behind the US-Mexico border. So again, different connections in how borders are violent spaces, violent colonial spaces. And Elbit Systems is responsible for that, so that's why they were one of our targets. And then we also had Boeing, and their weapons. They do, manufacture aircraft and weapons that supplies the Israeli military. So their weapons were used against civilians in Gaza in 2014. They're likely being used against civilians in Gaza right now. And after 2014, they received an $82 million contract to continue supplying bomb guiding systems to the Israeli military. So those are things that our university is likely invested in through all these different funds. And through our divestment campaign, we were asking the university to not be invested in them. And I think the hard thing about that is, like, these companies are shitty regardless. So for me, it's like, okay, if G4S pulls out of Israel, it's not like G4S is suddenly an ethical company. Like, I still don't want us to be invested in it. So I think it's really difficult sometimes when we're running campaigns like that, because, like, nothing is going to make investing in a weapons corporation okay just because it's not being used against my people, it's being used against some people. So I think the fact that we were connecting all these different, like, causes, it builds the foundation for us to, like, be able to push for more radical demands in the future. So that's kind of what I've been doing in the recent years, I guess. Because our first divestment campaign was similar. It was just, instead of a referendum that everyone could vote on, it was a resolution through student government. But this one, like, everyone had the ability to say yes or no. And I probably should have explained what BDS was before I went into all of that. So let me just go into that now. So BDS, for the past 13 years, since 2005, has been a campaign to get people in the international community to put pressure on Israel to abide by human rights law. So it was called for by Palestinian civil society. It's something like 30, no, it's more than that. It's like hundreds of groups, yeah. That have called for BDS and for people to support it. So if you're for Palestinian self-determination, you have to be for BDS, and it has 3 main goals. So ending Israel's occupation and colonization of all Arab lands and dismantling the wall. So pulling out of the Golan Heights, pulling out of, which is Syria, pulling out of the West Bank, pulling out of Gaza, but then we're also talking about 48 land. And then recognizing the fundamental rights of Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality, and respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. So that's talking about the right of return. So again, when we're thinking about the symbol of the key, the return of millions of Palestinian refugees who are displaced to this day, who are not allowed to go back, who are still in refugee camps in Lebanon, in Jordan, in the West Bank, and being able to return to their homes. And so I think the right of return is something that we can't, like, compromise on, because that's a big part of advocating for Palestine. Like, if you don't recognize the right of return, you don't recognize Palestinian self-determination. I think that's really all I have to say about BDS, but I guess I can actually explain what BDS is. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So boycott is more of on an individual level, so it's like me not buying Sabra hummus because I have morals. The D is for divestment, so again, asking institutions like the University of Minnesota or even like churches to take out investments they may have in corporations such as Raytheon, G4S, etc. And then sanctions is more on a government level, so it's like getting up to that point where internationally, like, states are actually holding Israel accountable and placing sanctions against Israel until it abides by international law. So those are the 3 different levels, and so boycott and divestment is where I think we have the most power, but again, it's like building up to sanctions. For example, the movement to divest, or for BDS in South Africa, was done through, like, young individuals on college campuses, you know, making their universities listen through really radical, like, direct actions where they were shutting down. For instance, on the University of Minnesota campus, they shut down, like, Board of Regents meetings for like 11 years. They would take over the Morrill Hall, which is the administration building. There was all these different things that they did, so I think it's a matter of, like, escalation. And then by the time that universities were starting to divest all over the country, there was also more talk of people like were aware of what South Africa was and what South Africa was doing and why apartheid was bad. And so it got to a point where the U.S. Congress was able to override Reagan's veto and pass sanctions against South Africa. So it ended apartheid, essentially. And that's not to say that, you know, like black South Africans didn't have a huge role in that. That's not to like overstate what role Americans have, but I think that as Americans we are in a unique role, or as people in America, we are in a really unique role to be able to put pressure on the United States and on Israel, because the United States has that special relationship. And so I think that's why BDS is really important. And again, I think if you don't support BDS and if you don't like agree with it, well, not even if you don't agree with it, I mean, you can have your personal opinions, but if you don't like support BDS in some way, I don't think you really support Palestinian self-determination, because like I said, it was hundreds of Palestinian civil society groups that have called for BDS. And that's been the most effective way for us to make change. Just seeing, like, because I was there at the University of Minnesota when we did the first divestment campaign, and just the change in how people talked about Palestine and how people like understood what we were talking about from, 2016 to 2018, it was huge. And so I think you have to keep pushing, you have to keep making sure you're educating people, making sure you're making those connections. So if that means going back and saying, well, this is what Zionism is, and this is what Israel is doing, and this is why it's wrong, and this is what a Palestinian is, because people still don't know what that is, and it's being able to make those connections and saying, well, actually, Israel was involved in the 1980s with the genocide of Mayans in Guatemala, and they actually were able to get those like contracts by basically selling what they're doing with the occupation. And so in some way, I was reading this article on electronic intifada about how basically they, in some ways, Palestinianized the Mayan people. I don't know if like that's a great terminology, but by using the same tactics. And that's what they do, they export their tactics. Again, going back to prison industrial complex, how Israel exports its violent tactics to the United States by having these police exchanges. And that's something that you can learn more about with Jewish Voice for Peace. They're doing a campaign called the Deadly Exchange to stop police exchanges from happening. And yeah, I don't know, I think that's just like the biggest thing that I want to like drive home is really talking about those connections, because I think that was what was the biggest difference between 2016 and 2018. Being able to say, well, actually, Palestinians are very similar to indigenous people here because we go through similar struggles, and being able to connect with those people and also connect with people who are like supportive of indigenous struggles, because then they'll have to like realize the cognitive dissonance of being able to like support, you know, people standing up against Line 3, but not Palestinians who are, you know, marching for the right to return or who are protesting Israeli settlements. So I think like pushing that is really, really important. And then that's kind of all I have to say about like activism and what I think is important. And then I can talk about resources more towards the end. Talk about Syria. But, yeah.
Thank you, Malak.
So I want to shout out all SJPers, but also, you know, like as someone who, you know, I'm a BDS organizer, and it's what students have been able to accomplish in terms of BDS is what helps the rest of us do our BDS work. So it's very inspiring and an honor to sit alongside students and hear, you know, like the ins and outs. And like they're so, the opposition is so afraid of student organizing that Sheldon Adelson is pouring in millions of dollars every single year to fight back against student BDS activism. And I'm pretty sure you all don't have anywhere near that amount of money.
Oh yeah, donate to SJP.
Yes. So yes, definitely donate to SJP. So thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you specifically to CISPOS for organizing this event. I'm a Syrian American activist who does organizing for Palestinian rights as my full-time work. So when I get a chance to talk about freedom and justice for both in Palestine and in Syria, and for Palestinians and Syrians, it's very special. So earlier this month, on July 12th, forces loyal to the regime of Bashar al-Assad raised their flag, so not this flag, but their flag, over Daraa, which was the city that was the birthplace of the 2011 Syrian uprising and revolution for justice and dignity. And while so much of the news that we hear out of Syria these days is unfortunately about violence, about massacres, about airstrikes, today what I really want to focus on is the people. I want to focus on their revolution. So that part of the story of Syria, the one that is really inspiring and beautiful and just heartwarming, doesn't get lost in all the other things, horrible things happening. And in the most recent history, that story starts in Daraa. So in March of 2011, some youth in Daraa painted slogans demanding freedom on the walls of their city. They were inspired by what was happening back then all across the region. In December 2010, the people of Tunisia had taken to the streets demanding the fall of their regime after a street vendor named Mohammed Bouazizi set himself on fire to protest his mistreatment by police. The protests continued for weeks and ended up forcing then dictator President Zain al-Abidine Ben Ali to flee after he had been in power for 24 years. And the call for the fall of the regime spread across the region, spread to Egypt, to Libya, to Yemen, to Bahrain, and even Iraq, where people obviously had been fighting, U.S. military occupation, so at that point. And people were inspired and encouraged. They saw videos coming out from each country and circulating videos and chants. And people were thinking, well, if they're out there in the street there, why can't we do it here in our homeland as well? I was in grad school in 2010, beginning of 2011, when all of this happening. And I remember I and a lot of my friends would wake up really early in the morning every day for months to just follow videos. Like, protests would start around noontime, so that would be like, 5 o'clock in the morning. And we would just sit there, and I don't know how anyone got any work done, because that's all we were doing, is just watching, videos out of Tahrir Square and like waiting and seeing what was going to happen. And there was such a feeling of excitement and hope that we were witnessing a breakthrough in a region that had suffered for so long the impacts of British and French colonialism, followed by dictatorship. Its people's needs and dreams always were secondary to the needs of and the interests of the United States and Israel. And of course, the destruction that the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq wrought was still having reverberations across the region at that point. And people were forced to really think, like, we have to either accept living under dictatorships, or we're going to have to accept living under U.S. bombs and U.S. occupation. And so watching the bravery of the millions of these people take to the streets in January and February of 2011, many people would turn to me and start thinking, like, is Syria next? And honestly, I would say no. I was like, no way. There's no way this would happen in Syria. And it was mostly based on how much of a grip I knew the Assad regime had on the country. The current president, Bashar al-Assad, inherited power after his father Hafiz died in 2000. Hafiz had ruled the country since 1970, and the Assad regime is, frankly, one of the most brutal regimes in the region, which is saying a lot, considering, I think these regimes, there's people that want to reach for, dream about getting a Nobel Peace Prize. I think these regimes think about getting a Nobel Prize in cruelty and brutality. Growing up, for example, I grew up in the United States, but I would go to Syria often. I knew that when I would visit that I shouldn't be discussing anything political. And no one actually ever explicitly told me that. Like, I sit back and think, did my parents ever sit me down and have that discussion with me? And they didn't. I don't recall it at all. It's just something I picked up as a kid to see how fearful people were, seeing how adults around you were to not say anything that would be perceived as critical of the regime. My parents both grew up in Damascus, but my mom's family is from Ramah, where in 1982, Hafiz al-Assad killed an estimated 40,000 people to repress efforts to resist his regime. No one ever talked about that massacre in my family, but everyone knew about it and feared it, and feared that the same would ever happen again if anyone ever dared rise up. And like in Egypt and Tunisia, where there was some freedom of press, and some space for political organizing, and not to, again, whitewash, and those regimes were brutal at the time. And in Egypt, what we see under Sisi is even scarier than what was under Mubarak, unfortunately. In Syria, there was only state-owned media, outlets, and only one political party that you could really allow to join, the Ba'ath Party, which was the party that was in power. But in March of 2011, the people of Daraa proved me wrong. They, again, inspired by what they were seeing across in neighbor countries, they painted these freedom slogans on the walls of their cities. They were quickly arrested by the mukhabarat, so the FBI, if we want to, in terms of what it made, similarities to U.S., but the intelligence services, and tortured. And immediately protests erupted demanding their release, and then as well as addressing other grievances such as unemployment, high rates of unemployment, and other socioeconomic issues that people were facing. And the regime quickly reacted with force in an attempt to repress the protest. By this time, in March 2011, we should remember that the people of Egypt had ousted Hosni Mubarak. They had succeeded in making him step down after he'd been in power for 30 years. At that point, NATO was pretty much, was the beginning of NATO intervention in Libya, where people had risen up against Gaddafi's brutal regime, and NATO had decided to intervene due to his brutal response to protest there. And the Assad regime was seeing what was happening and decided, we need to shut things down and quell any further unrest. Protesters were beaten and met with tear gas, and within a few weeks, the regime sent its tanks to escalate its violence against its own people. What the regime, I think, failed to understand from the beginning was that these protests that were breaking out in a small city like Daraa, so Daraa is like, way in the southwest part of the country near the Jordan border, and not a major city. What they failed to understand is that these things couldn't remain isolated incidents in, say, Daraa and then the surrounding villages, as people heard what was happening in Daraa. Saw people killed and were going out in the streets to protest in solidarity with their fellow people. And that there's no way that the grievances that were being held by people and the demands were things felt across the country. There was an issue of stagnated salaries as the cost of living had increased sharply across the last few years. Drought was impacting rural areas. The regime's neoliberal policies meant the slashing of subsidies, and obviously that meant everything was becoming more expensive. And of course, the regional context. We can never forget the regional context. I think today, again, we fail. People because the region is in such a dark place, we forget what was actually happening in 2011, the beauty of what was happening. And the regional context meant that while none of the problems that Syrians were facing were new problems, they were seeing what others in the regions were doing and were able to accomplish just going out in the streets and making their demands. And they gave them hope that they too can do the same. Like if Hosni Mubarak was able to be forced out of power, why not the Assad regime? So soon the barrier of fear was broken across the country as protests spread to major cities like Homs and Hama, so we're talking now more in the center of the country. Protests spread to the Kurdish parts of the country, in the northeast, so the Kurds even have, the Kurds who were not considered citizens, for example, at that time, and the regime at some point all of a sudden was like, oh yeah, you're all citizens now, as a way to quell kind of protests there. But the protests were happening there. There were even protests in the capital of Damascus itself, which probably terrified the regime that people in the closest proximity to them were no longer afraid either. And so the regime decided to crack down on protests. And as the crackdown escalated and it became more vicious and more brutal, specifically in April 2011, when they tortured Hamza al-Khatib, a 13-year-old, and returned his tortured body to his family with his penis, I'm going to be graphic, his penis cut off. He had cigarette burns all across his country. His body, if people know the case of Emmett Till in this country, like that's what it reminded me of. Like his body was so tortured that his own family had trouble really recognizing him. That pushed people, again, of just like how if this regime has no, if this is how cruel the regime is going to react, there's no turning back. We have to keep pushing forward. So more people came out in the streets. And again, like I said, so much of the coverage today in Syria is about violence and portraying Syrians as victims with really no agency. I really urge us to go back and really read about the stories and watch the videos of the amazing direct action that took place, the amazing unarmed resistance, the amazing civil disobedience, the creativity of the protesters who went out. There were songs and chants that filled the air during the protests, the massive sit-ins that happened, the strikes, worker strikes, that disrupted business as usual. Cartoons were produced, posters, videos people created and uploading all on YouTube and various social media sites. Protesters would hand dates and flowers to the regime's soldiers, encouraging them, like, you can come and join us. We want you to be part of our protests. You can be part of us changing our country. They created new media outlets, which is, again, a huge thing for a country that had nothing outside of state-controlled media. That now, for the first time, there was independent media spaces. Local councils started popping up all across the country, where people would come together and discuss our protest plans and start imagining what the future of their country would look like. So when I watch now videos of protests now, 7 years later, it's really hard to digest just how the reality in Syria today is so different from what it could have been back in 2011. And many factors led us to what this reality is today. Today, the Assad regime is still in power. He is consolidating his control over previously liberated areas. The entire international community for years now has kind of decided we need to keep Assad in power. But now it's like, it's a more reality of like, okay, he's staying in power and everyone's going back into the mode of normalizing that fact. And it's sad because at least 500,000 Syrians have been killed, though this number, the UN had this number as the death toll like years ago, and they stopped counting years ago. So it could be easily double it, really, in reality. There are 6 million Syrians who are refugees, and the idea of Syrians being refugees is a very hard one because Syria for so long hosted so many of the region's refugees. So whether it was Palestinian refugees or Lebanese refugees or Iraqi refugees, the fact that there are now 6 million Syrian refugees is a lot to swallow. And then in addition, there's another 6.5 million who are internally displaced. And then an unknown number of people, it might be thousands, it might be tens of thousands, who are forcibly disappeared in the regime's torture dungeons. So in prisons and facing horrific there. So pretty much Syria has 20 million population in 2011. 2/3 of that population has been a direct victim of this regime's war on Syria. So what factors, kind of just thinking about analyzing of what factors helped get us to these dark days from the beautiful early days of the revolution where there was so much hope and excitement. So a couple of things I want us to think about. One, going back to 2003 and what the US invasion and occupation of Iraq. And again, the impact that still has till this day of the sectarianism that set off, the violence, just a lot, just horrible. What happened in Iraq, as I'm assuming a lot of you are anti-war activists and understand, like it was violence and an occupation that destroyed a society, and not obviously the society under Saddam Hussein was a war criminal. His people would have risen up against him eventually, just like people rose up. But what the United States did was criminal, and there's obviously been no accountability whatsoever for what happened. So that's part of the picture. Another part of the picture is the NATO's intervention in Libya in 2011, where again that signaled to Assad, and then signaled more to Assad's backers, Iran and Russia, that they need to double down on their support. That hey, there might be interest in NATO countries to help with Syrian revolutionaries oust Assad, and that made them very fearful because then they would lose any and all control that they had kind of in the region. We're back to this now with Trump. I don't know if people saw Trump's tweet about Iran last night, but since the 90s, the US and Israel have been pushing for war on Iran And that is part of the talk too, in terms of like when we're talking, you know, and not because they care about the Iranian people. Again, this is about, you know, their own security. For Israel, it's more about as long as you can deflect from Palestine, and this is a deflection from Palestine. And you know, the role Israel played in helping in convincing the U.S. to occupy and to invade Iraq, and the idea was, well, Iran is next, and you know, the lies around Iranian nuclear weapons. Bibi since Benjamin Netanyahu since the 90s. Has been claiming that Iran is, you know, is about to get, within, you know, 2 to 3 years, Iran's going to have a nuclear weapon. So complete lies, but it's a whole lie because it's about, again, deflecting from Palestine and the issue of Palestinian rights. And then slowly Syria became a global battleground. It became a battleground between the geopolitics. So again, on the forces who wanted to make sure that the regime stays in power. So that includes Iran, that includes Russia, that includes Hezbollah, and then the various sort of militias that Iran would bring into the country. So like, for example, Iran would force Afghan refugees that were living in Iran to go fight in Syria. So all these people play powers, and then on the side, I don't want to say they're the so-called fronts of the revolution, so-called fronts. No one has the interests of the Syrian people in mind other than the Syrian people themselves, but the front, so that includes the United States, that includes the various Gulf powers from Saudi Arabia to Qatar to the UAE, who, you know, we're always promising a lot more we're always promising a lot more of support to the revolution than they actually ever gave or they actually wanted to give. And they were very clear what any support they gave was stringent on, again, their own interest of making sure that they control whatever the outcome is. And then the war on terror, the fact that the war on terror, which George W. Bush launched after 9/11, and the first, obviously, part of that was the invasion and continuing occupation of Afghanistan. You know, we're now in 2018, and 17 years later, the U.S. still continues to occupy Afghanistan. But the war on terror has become a global war on terror, where any power that wants to just claims they're fighting terrorism, and people are like, okay, that makes sense. So that's what Syria has become. It's become an issue of a war on terror. So the U.S. is fighting ISIS, Russia's fighting ISIS, Turkey's fighting, you know, their, you know, Kurdish terrorists. It's just everyone is out to ensure that the people they don't like are labeled as terrorists, and that they're able to kill those people as they please. And then, frankly, international community incompetence, where the UN has been unable to do much, as Russia and both between Russia and China, their veto power. So the same as what the U.S. has done with Israel to protect Israel for decades. Russia has protected the regime from power, and then I think a lack of solidarity. So beyond just the institutions, which frankly, again, I work on Palestine, so I don't have much trust in the UN as much. But what Malak described in terms of BDS and the ability for people worldwide to take action in support of Palestinian rights, unfortunately, we've seen a lack of that solidarity. And to be very fair, obviously, to the point, you know, it took decades to build a solidarity movement in support of Palestinians. So it's not like, oh, automatically that's what's going to happen in Syria. I think what's been frustrating about Syria is about how people who should get it don't get it. Where there's been enough where, because the regime claims that it is an anti-imperialist regime, even though it is a lie, it is a pure lie. Like I said, the regime is one that, for example, was okay with the US invasion of Iraq. It's a regime that worked with the CIA in its rendition program, its torture rendition program. They would accept people from the United States that the US government wanted tortured, and they would torture them on behalf of the US government. And the CIA was very clear, if you really wanted someone to be tortured, that's where you would send them. You would send them to Syria. So people follow the case of Canadian Syrian Maher Arrar, who was wrongly renditioned. You know, the U.S. government thought he was a suspected quote-unquote terrorist, sent him to Syria, and he was tortured. And then finally they were like, oops, we made a mistake. And then our government, our court system didn't even let him sue the U.S. government. He got some justice from the Canadian government, but the U.S. government Not at all. But so this is the, the neoliberal policies that I mentioned in terms of, the idea of like the rich got richer and the poor got poorer because we were slashing subsidies and we were just privatizing everything. Everything was being privatized. Like, how can you be an anti-imperialist when you're like feeding into the capitalist neoliberalism? Like that's the front of how we fight. That is part of imperialism in terms of neoliberalism and capitalism. So a lot of that has confused people to the point where they either actively believe propaganda out of the regime, where it's like, yeah, this is just a Zionist conspiracy. This is a Google conspiracy. It's a Zionist, CIA, Mossad, Google, Turkey, Gulf conspiracy. As if the Syrian people again have no agency. People literally believe that Syria was a socialist country because there was free education and free healthcare, and it's like, okay, but that doesn't mean that's not socialism. Like just the free, that kind of stuff, and then the quality of it is another story. It doesn't matter if you have free healthcare and free education, and it's crappy healthcare and crappy education, if you have no political rights whatsoever. Like that idea of like, you have some economic rights, so you can do away with the political rights. And then for people who don't go to that extreme, who don't actually believe in like the Assad project and the Assad propaganda, the inability to speak out against that, or the inability to be like, I just don't know, because the successfulness of, again, the propaganda from the regime, very much supported by Russia, means people, again, it's just like they're paralyzed because they're like, well, I don't know what to believe. And for activists who are leftists, who are anti-war, who are used to a binary of imperialism and anti-imperialism, and that binary is the US and everyone else, we've seemed to have lost our critical thinking skills. And it's just like, well, if you're against the US, you're good, you're my friend, and I'm not going to speak up against you. Or, well, I have a duty to speak up about the US war crimes, and I don't need to speak up about anyone else. And it's a very, unfortunately, not internationalist stance of how we should be thinking about things. We shouldn't be limiting our solidarity based on the borders. I consider, as a leftist, I think like internationalism is a #1 priority for all of us. Like wherever people are who are oppressed, we should be on the side of the oppressor, no matter who's doing the oppression. So I'm just gonna end with just a couple more points specifically around Palestine and Syria, and why these two need to be talked about together. And it's very disconcerting to me that we don't actually talk more about them together. That there's Palestinian activism happening and the whole active Palestinian solidarity movement, and then there's folks who are interested in Syria and the whole Syrian solidarity movement, and rarely do they really interact with one another, even though like the countries are not right next to each other. So when Malak was talking about Zionism and talking a little bit about the impact of Zionism on Palestinians, and obviously Palestinians are first and foremost the victims of Zionism, but Zionism's impact goes beyond that. It goes against, the region. It goes against Muslims worldwide. The role Zionism plays and Zionist institutions play in propagating Islamophobia is huge, because as Malak was describing, part of the appeal of Israel is to continue like we are the light, like those are the barbarians, those are the savages, but we are like Europe, we are like the United States, we're civilized. And to continue that myth, they have to continue to push Islamophobic tropes. And again, it's not, and the Israel lobby and Zionist supporters understand that history, and so they know that they have an in with the United States to continue to do that. So that's one, in terms of, we have to talk about the impact of Zionism beyond just on the region itself. And Syria that has occupied territory, the Golan Heights has been occupied by Israel since 1967. And it's been the quietest border, quote unquote, for the Israelis. And the Israelis would admit that. And so again, the idea that this is the Assad is anti-Zionist and he's anti-Israel and that's why Israel wants him gone is a joke, because he's protected Israel. When the regime first sent its tanks to Daraa, people were mocking him. They're like, the Golan is that way. Why are you sending the tanks here? Like, go free, you know, you talk about freeing our land. Go actually free it. It's, you know, it's been occupied since 1967. So that's one point I want to make. The other point I want to make in terms of the specific role of Palestinians in Syria and Palestinian refugees in Syria. So there was hundreds of thousands, at least 150,000 Palestinian refugees in Syria, all across the country, but mostly in Yarmouk camp, refugee camp, which is in the suburbs of Damascus, and for many Palestinians was considered the hub of Palestinian diaspora. And Palestinian refugees get different rights in different countries. They're treated the worst in Lebanon. They're treated the best in Jordan. Syria was like an in-between sort of thing. So they had definitely more rights than they had in Lebanon, but they weren't granted citizenship like they were in Jordan, for example. And the regime likes to talk a lot about, again, how it's at the forefront of protecting Palestinian rights. And yet this is, again, a farce. And this was a farce long before what 2011 started in the revolution. So the massacre in 1976 as part of the Lebanese, people say the Civil War, and there was lots of, phases of the Civil War. But in 1976, there was a massacre in one of the refugee camps. So a lot of people, I think, may know about the Sabra and Shatila massacre that happened in 1982. Which was, Israel pretty much allowed extremist phalangist forces to go into Sabra and Shatila, Palestinian refugee camps, and just massacre people. Well, 6 years earlier, there was a massacre at another Palestinian refugee camp in Lebanon called Tel Za'atar. And that was a massacre that was facilitated by the Assad regime, so Hafiz. There was a Palestinian branch of the intelligence. There's a branch of the intelligence forces in Syria called the Palestine branch, and it is notorious for being actually the one that engaged in the worst forms of torture. So imagine, like, you're thinking that you're honoring Palestine by naming, the branch of the intelligence that engaged in the worst forms of torture and that. And then when the revolution started, I think Palestinian Syrian refugees were put in a bind. Like, what do you do? There are people who they don't have anywhere else to go. They have nowhere, like, they're not allowed to go back to their homeland, as Malak was saying. They're not denied their right of return. And so, it's very hard. And yet, eventually, Palestinian Syrian refugees, there was a lot of people from early on, and then more and more people rose up. People in Yarmouk rose up, people in different camps rose up, and were supporting, Syrians in their revolution. And it was, again, very powerful and very beautiful. And I think, again, what the hope of these revolutions is, in May of 2011, so the first Nakba Day protest that took place after the revolutions had started, Palestinian refugees in both Lebanon and Syria decided, you know what, we're just going to walk home. So the Great Return March that you're seeing happening in Gaza now, people are like, we're just going to walk home. And there was a version of that happened in 2011 of refugees in Lebanon and Syria. And they started walking, and they were shot at. And it wasn't the Israelis shooting at them, it was the Syrian regime, or the Lebanese government, the Lebanese regime. So again, like, there's idea that Assad is somehow supportive of Palestinians is ridiculous. There's been about 3,000 Palestinians killed, many of them under torture. Yarmouk camp has been decimated. So the regime first bombed Yarmouk in December of 2012, and then slowly, completely put it under siege for years. So again, another Palestinian population. Again, we know Gaza's under siege now for 11 plus years. There's another Palestinian population put under siege for years, but it's not by Israel, it's by the Syrian regime that claims to be a supporter of the Palestinian people. Yarmouk had a population of about 150,000. It's pretty much down to maybe 10,000 at this point. These are people who have been forced to flee, so refugees who are now twice made refugees. And when we talk about Palestine, the right of return is such a big part of the movement. Well, these are people who are now, it's even harder to understand, to be able to realize their right of return, because now they're scattered in in Europe or in other parts of the country, and facing even worse challenge, because while Syrian refugees services are provided by UNHCR, the UN, I don't know what UNHCR, whatever that stands for, UN High Commission for Refugees, yes. The Palestinian refugees come under UNRWA, so it's a completely different thing. And UNRWA has been for years as a way for Israel to get rid of the idea of a Palestinian refugee one for all. They've been pushing to like defund UNRWA and cut services. So Trump, that's his biggest thing. I think he recently cut like a lot of money to UNRWA services because they want to get rid of this idea that there's a Palestinian refugee. And so I think it's very important that when we're talking about Palestine, when we're talking about Syria, to really make these connections and to understand that there's no way there's going to be freedom for Syria, while frankly the Zionist regime exists in the form it does. And there's not going to be liberation of Palestine while not only the Syrian regime, but really all the Arab regimes, because these are all, dirty players working to support each other. We're in a world now where all these regimes are coming together. We're seeing the rise of fascism across Europe. These regimes are, it's not coincidence that Netanyahu is best friends with Trump and Putin. It's not coincidence that Putin talks about Syria. He goes and he talks to Iran and Turkey about Syria because they are now all occupiers of Syria. And then he goes and talks about Syria with Trump and Israel, who are also occupiers of Syria. So, again, the idea, people talk a lot about sovereignty, like Syrian sovereignty, and that's why we need to support Assad because he's protecting Syria's sovereignty. It is because of Assad now that there are 6 different countries who are occupying Syria, and Syria as a nation state really does not exist anymore. So I'll end there. I think one last thing, because we're in a, again, very dark time. Terry yesterday asked me, what do you think is going to happen in Syria? And it was hard for me to think of anything positive. But I do want to urge people, one, we need to think about the refugees. And again, refugee between Palestine and Syria. The refugee rights need to be essential. And we need to figure out ways to protect their rights and to continue helping them survive until they have a way, until it's time for them to go home. And helping them survive does not mean us being like a savior complex from the United. We're going to save these people. It's what are the basic needs that they need that we can help provide so they can do their self-organizing. They don't need us to teach them how to liberate. They know what they need to liberate themselves. They know what liberation for them looks like. But they're so under extreme conditions. So how can we lessen those conditions so that they have the space to have the ability to organize and think about what their futures would potentially look like. So that's one thing I want to add. And then another thing I want to stress, people, you need to talk to your friends about Syria, you need to talk to your friends about Palestine, read. People know nothing. Really, it's ridiculous how little people know. And then especially with Syria in terms of the revolution, watch those videos. Remind people to watch those videos because again, we think violence is not inspiring. Seeing death and destruction on your television does not inspire people. What inspires people is seeing wow, this is what Syrians did in 2011. They were able to do X, Y, Z. They were able to liberate certain towns. They were able to create these local committees and talk about their future. Let's think about that. Let's go back. Let's learn about this. Let's connect with let's connect with Syrian refugees if there are refugees in your community. Let's support these efforts and really that education part. And there's different, if you're an educator, just have your students read a book about Syria. If you're an artist, do an exhibit about Syrian art. If you're, a musician, the music, there's so many amazing Syrian musicians and art coming out of it. Make it part of your life. If you're a doctor, go to go on a delegation, a medical humanitarian aid delegation, and use your thing. Because it's not, I think a lot of times people are well, I have so much in my mind. Find ways to really connect it to your day-to-day life. And I think that's the least we can do. And even we do not believe, even simply because so many times Syrians are no one cares about us, if people in their communities are just coming together to talk about Syria and letting people know this is what's happening, it makes a whole lot of difference and gives people hope that, okay, there's people interested in what we continue to go through. So I'll end it. Thank you.
find pretty easily, but if you start there, you'll be able to find more.
Thank you.
Each other. Yeah.
So that's a tough one because I'm still not. I think Putin can still keep Trump from bombing Iran. I think if they Putin is like the main player. Okay, let's say now, frankly, in the region, because the U.S. is kind of like, since Obama backed away from his red line back in 2013 after the chemical attack in Ghouta, and since he pretty much gave Saudi Arabia like a green light to continue doing whatever they want in Yemen, the U.S. is kind of like, okay, whatever, we're done with the region. And then Trump comes to power, and Trump is interesting because, you know, he says, he talks a lot, he talks from all sides of his mouth, but his relationship with Putin is one that frankly has been like the most direct thing, that like the thing that hasn't moved much, even though people will be like, well, he bombed Assad, so obviously he was against, like he bombed an empty airfield. He bombed an empty building. Like, who cares? Like, that didn't change anything in the calculations of what happened. So I think Putin is balancing U.S., Trump's obsession with, and again, the long-term obsession of the U.S. with regime change in Iran. He's balancing Israel's obsession with the regime change in Iran, and Israel freaking out that, Iran is in Syria, like there's Iranian troops and militias in Syria. And then he's balancing out Iran and Turkey's needs, because Iran is definitely in terms of they're the ones who are backing Assad. So they don't want to fight each other, because that would be weird. And that would weaken kind of their ability to keep Assad propped up. And then Turkey plays an interesting role, because again, Erdogan at first was like, yeah, we obviously support the people, they host the largest number of Syrian refugees, have been the most welcoming of all the countries to Syrian refugees, and yet Erdogan also shut down the border to Turkey, so they're not accepting any more refugees. Erdogan himself has committed war crimes against Kurdish communities, both within the borders of Turkey and then in Syria itself. And they're very much, Turkey is now occupying, they went in and occupied liberated Kurdish areas. And there are Kurdish fighting forces that decided, you know what, we would rather go back under regime control than risk it under Turkish control. And it's something that I understand. So I think still that Putin, he doesn't want to risk what he was able to accomplish in Syria. And if he can convince Trump to just be like, hey, listen, we'll push Iran out where you want them to be pushed, but do not bomb Iran. And he'll convince Bibi that, listen, you can bomb Syria wherever you want. And then he'll talk to Iran and be like, we'll warn you when Netanyahu's going to bomb you. I think we'll continue. Obviously, though, when John Bolton is who Trump is listening to. The guy is John Bolton is a horrific human being. And maybe he'll be like, no, I do want to bomb Iran. But I think Putin's going to try his hardest to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm from the Socialist Workers Party. And our starting point in looking at the Middle East is how we can advance the real possibilities of organizing solidarity between workers and farmers and oppressed people throughout the region, including in Israel. I think it's very important that when we think of Israel, we recognize that it is a class-divided society. That the Israeli government, the Israeli state represents the ruling class there, and that there are possibilities and really a necessity to build a common movement between those that are oppressed and exploited under capitalism throughout the region and the world. And I think that it's important to recognize not only the blood-drenched history that the Palestinians and those and peoples throughout the Middle East have experienced, but the Jews have as well. And it is that drives the desire and the need for a Jewish refuge. And so it's really impossible to think about politics in the Middle East without recognizing some of those real historic
Do you have
realities.
a question in there?
Well, I want to interject a different view and assessment into the discussion, and I think it's an important one, and I think that the possibility of starting with trying to advance solidarity amongst the toilers in the region, including in Israel, is an important perspective.
You can choose to respond or not as you wish, because this platform is really for you. So if you want to address what he has to say, feel free, or we can move on to another question. Because there wasn't really a question in there.
Yeah, I don't really know how to respond to that, but I don't know. I understand the outlook of like, let's unite the working class, but we also have to think about how there's a difference between the colonizing working class and the Palestinian working class. And I don't really know what else to say.
Right.
Thank you, Malak. I will also add, if I may.
Yeah.
Zionism is white supremacy. It's just, there's no, so when we need to decolonize Palestine. And then we can talk about working class solidarity across the region.
Okay. I saw another hand in the back. Yes.
I had a question, like more of like coming from like a place like in the region of like the Syrian conflict. I found it hard. I've been finding it hard to like find a new position just because like for one, like I was very inspired by the Syrian revolution in 2011. Like I feel like the Syrian people there. But acknowledging, I feel like acknowledging regime change and the havoc that it brings, for me, makes it hard to, I guess what I'm trying to ask is like, so it's kind of like there's this, either you're with Bashar al-Assad or you're with the United States, like people are kind of looking at it like dualistically, and for someone who like, I want to support the Syrian people, I just feel like, how do you feel, what do you feel like is the best like next like step to do it? Because I feel like at this point with armed conflict, it's a slippery slope to support any group that's like supported by the United States. But I feel like that doesn't. I don't know, I'm kind of confused on the whole.
No, I appreciate your question, and it's not. I don't want to claim that Syria is easy. Like it's not. There's like I said, when there's a lot of players at force, and that duality that you mentioned is that I think that's what we need to disrupt that. We need to disrupt that because people now say it's either Assad or ISIS, and they forget the Syrian people in all of that. And we can't continue giving people the choice in the region between two extremist murderers. Except some of these people are so-called secular and these people are so-called religious. Because that's an unfair choice and it's not a real choice. There are people in the region and again, when there was areas of Syria that were liberated and people had to come together and figure out how to run their lives, they were able to do it. They were able to do, for people who identify as anarchists, I think that's the closest to what I identify. I was very actually excited because it's like, oh, look, when people are given space to self-organize and set up their own things, they don't need this like idea of like a nation state and a centralized government. They can figure things out as they go. So I think we need to really disrupt the narrative that there is just Assad or ISIS. We need to disrupt the narrative that you getting whatever sort of support from the U.S. and let's be very clear, U.S. support to Syrian armed groups was very, very limited. They got some weapons, they got things like mud goggles, they got food, but it doesn't compare to. That's nothing that's going to come down to what they were facing in terms of airstrikes. The regime has been bombing Syria since 2012. That's 6+ years of just airstrikes with maybe a week or two break here and there. That is a horrific number of airstrikes that are being bombed, whether it's bear bombs or airstrikes or chemical weapons. Like, that's a lot. That's not something you're going to beat with some guns. And Obama himself made sure that they did not get more sophisticated weapons. Obama forbade Saudi Arabia, for example, from sending them. I'm not into the military stuff, so man-pads, yes. The man-pads that they would be used to potentially shoot down regime airplanes. He stopped that. So again, the idea that the United States was actually supporting armed groups is one that is somewhat true, but when you look at the material aspect of that, it was very limited. And the point was, well, we don't really want to support them. We want to seem like we're supporting them, but we don't, because they didn't know what was going to also come after Assad. And they wanted to make sure if they were going to topple Assad, they wanted to make sure, if the United States was really going to go all in and help topple Assad, they wanted to make sure what came after was someone they could control. They couldn't find anyone that they could really do that. So I think we just need to, to me, the very basic is oppressed people have a right to resist, whether it's in Palestine, or in Syria, or here in the United States. And sometimes that gets bloody. And I'm someone who's very much anti-militarist, anti-war. I do not like the fact that it became an armed conflict. It really bothers me, because I think, again, it limits the number of people who can take up arms. Not everyone's going to be willing to take up arms. Not everyone's going to be able to take up arms. But also, I'm not going to be mad that people felt the need to defend themselves. And that they felt that if they didn't take up arms, they were going to be completely shattered. So I think we just need to continue to be like, you can declare your solidarity with the Syrian people, and that should not be assumed that somehow that's declaring solidarity with regime change, because it's not regime change. It's about the people who rose up. Regime change is outsiders coming in and deciding for the people. The people rose up, and what they choose to do to accept support in that, I think we should need to be very careful about how we judge that. And that make sure that if we're critiquing that, we're also then critiquing the violence that they faced. Because a lot of times we don't critique that. We're just saying, oh, well, they became violent, and that's why the regime had to do what they did. No, the regime was violent long before anyone took up arms. And even if there was that, is that an equal, where does our solidarity lie? Our solidarity should never be with regimes, with states, with countries. Our solidarity should be with people. Syria, we haven't discussed the class issue. A lot of times we talk about religion, we talk about sectarianism, and that's how the discussion, it's like, oh, the Sunnis are fighting the Shia, are fighting the Alawi, are fighting the Christians, and we actually don't talk about class, and we don't actually analyze that. So Obama once said something ridiculous about describing the rebel groups, oh, these are just farmers, and in terms of, he degraded them. And I remember my mom was once in a meeting with a congressperson who I think tried to say that same line to her, and she was like, well, it was these farmers and these workers that you're making fun of that have been able to continue to fight the regime with little support from the rest of the world. So I think in Syria, we're really lacking the class analysis. And the fact that, again, the revolution started in Daraa. Daraa is not where the rich business people in Damascus and Aleppo are. It was where people who are suffering, people who are in poverty, people who have farm, the farmers. That's where that revolution started. And it took a long time. The business Sunni classes in both Damascus and Aleppo were against the revolution. But we don't want to talk about it because then the idea is that, again, this is a sectarian, Sunni versus Shia, and all of a sudden when you're like, no, actually, if you add class, you see that's not the issue. Sectarianism is part of it. I don't want to deny it. Sectarianism is part of it. It's what Assad banked on. He knew that if you can inflame things on sectarian identity, then things would get a lot worse, and he won on that. But I think we definitely the class issue. So the issue of the left and Syria. I think again there's a and believe it or not, I've also had to teach myself that it's not actually this is not unique to Syria. So if you think for people back in the 90s when the genocide was happening against Bosnians, and how many leftists defended Milosevic and came out in terms of like, no, these are all lies. Srebrenica didn't happen. This is a lie. In Iraq, how many people, and Iraq was, I don't think it wasn't as clear in Iraq because with Iraq, it was so clear that George W. Bush was intent, and we had to just like figure out ways to talk about the U.S. But how many people who were leading protests were actually like fans of Saddam Hussein? We shouldn't assume the left was the left took a long time to get points to a good point on Palestine. There was a lot in terms of when we're talking about Zionism and folks who romanticize Zionism, especially folks who romanticize it as like, oh yeah, the kibbutz movement and communism, like there was that romanticization of it from socialists, from communists, and not, again, ignoring everything else of like, you all colonizing land, but I guess you're setting up a commune, that's great, so it took a while time. So I think that's something that I've had to also understand of this, like there's nothing necessarily unique about Syria. I think another thing is people are stuck in old school mentalities of like US and Soviet Union, and not understanding like the Soviet Union no longer exists. Capitalism is what rules, like there's everyone's capitalist at this point. So how do you talk about the idea that there's no alternative to capitalism? So everything that was wrong with the Soviet Union, the brutality, etc., there was an attempt at an alternative system of economics. So there was an actual other bloc. There is not that anymore. Russia is not, no matter how many people claim that it is, are confused. Russia is a capitalist society, and it is not communist. And so I think that also adds up. We just never, since 1991, we haven't been able to develop of what does it mean to be left when there isn't an alternative to capitalism at this moment. Everyone's capitalist, and we haven't figured out how to deal with that. And then the capitalism gets mixed up with imperialism. And again, the U.S., I don't want to deny, listen, the U.S. is definitely the strongest military force in the world. The U.S. definitely has the most bases in the world. The U.S. definitely spends the most money on military in the world. We in the United States have a duty and an obligation to talk about that. But how do we talk about that in a way that is internationalist and does not exceptionalize the U.S. as the only imperialist power, as the only military power, and the fact that, again, Russia's on the rise, China's on the rise. What China's doing in Africa is imperialist. And the idea that people will say, no, that's not actually imperialist, it just doesn't, it does not logically sense, because they've become attuned to things being wrong because the U.S. is doing them versus, no, imperialism is wrong no matter who's doing it. Capitalism is wrong, not because of the U.S., it's just wrong. And what can we do? I think it's very important because, like you're saying, there's so many people coming up and saying, oh yeah, I want to join Democratic Socialists of America, or I identify as a socialist. That's why those spaces, the ones that are not completely